If you're a guest today, I've got good news for you. The talk today is short. The bad news is if you think it's long, you're going to really think next week is long. I want to be full disclosure that the talk today is about half, maybe even a third of the words I like to spew out into the universe every week. I'm glad you're here. My name is Ryan again. I'm the lead pastor at Crossroads Church, which is a very beautiful and wonderful and special place that has been here for about 27, 28 years. And it's a privilege to get to be a part of the story being told here in Northern Colorado and beyond. We've been in a series called Mainsail. Resiliency in the Storm is what it's called. And we're looking at what does it mean to build a resilient life. And we launched this series on Easter, and we said at the very beginning that as people following the peacemaking path of Jesus or exploring the peacemaking path of Jesus, really the mainsail, what empowers us, what harnesses the strength of the wind is this sail that's based on this beautiful story of the resurrection, which is a story of hope even in the face of death, and that there is a love that is greater than death, and there is a way of living that is stronger than death, and there's a way of dying that's greater than living. And so that's kind of what we started to unpack. And you're welcome to, in the app, go back and listen to any of these if you'd like to catch up. But we've been talking about different ways and different strategies to build resiliency and where we find kind of the origination of these ideas that live in our world, often in our scriptures that we find in the Christian scriptures, oftentimes called the Bible or the Old Testament, the New Testament, all that good stuff. Raise your hand up nice and high. If you're tuning in online, give me a thumbs up in the chat room if you all have ever had stress, anxiety in life, right? A few of us, some of right now you're stressed, you're anxious. You're like, oh, I thought we were ending. There was a closing song, and here we are, talk notes, your stress level rises. Here's what happens when we experience stress and anxiety in our lives. We have a tendency to lose what matters most in life. Right? Stress can come in and sometimes it can push us eventually to rediscover what matters most. But oftentimes, when the stresses of life come and weigh in on us, we lose track of what matters most. And oftentimes, it's those little paper cut things, right? I'm not talking about the big, massive things that really do immediately can draw our attention to what matters most in life. But when life is just filled with the little paper cuts, right? When life is filled with the moments of anxiety, the stressors that we all go through, it's easy for us to forget what matters most. And one of the greatest things that we all want in life, right? And I'm going to speak for you today. I try not to do that very often, but I think that this is a true statement, and you can nod or agree, or if you're online, give me a thumbs up in the comment section, that one of our greatest desires that we have as human beings, it doesn't matter whether what your gender is, it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter what faith you hold to, your tradition, your culture, like one of our greatest desires is to live with and have and understand a sense of purpose. Right? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Like, what does it all mean? What am I here for? And we all want to live with this sense that our life is moving with intention, that there's meaning in our life, that there's meaning in the struggles, that there's meaning in the triumphs, that there's meaning in the in-between phases, right, where we're just kind of moving sideways. The Russian novelist Dostoevsky, a 19th century Russian novelist, super influential person known for his psychological depth of writing and like philosophical explorations. And he had this profound understanding of the human condition, and he wrote these beautiful novels. He won the Brothers Karamazov. Just a fascinating writer. Influenced a lot of thinkers, influenced people like writers like Kafka, philosophers like Nietzsche, and Freud was even heavily influenced by him. But he wrote this little statement that's really powerful. He said, the secret of man's being, pardon the patriarchal language, he was a 19th century Russian, and we're still dealing with it in 21st century America, right? So we would say like the secret of humanity's existence, right? But he said the secret of man's being is not only to live, but to have something to live for. Does that resonate with you? Does that resonate that, I don't want to just live, but I want to have something to live for? And one of the most powerful ways that we can kind of not discover, because I personally don't believe that purpose is discovered. I think that purpose is created in our lives. I think we can spend our lives trying to find purpose and find meaning, and that will lead to a lot of disappointment and a lot of heartache. But life is about making meaning. Life is about making purpose, right? Living into a purpose. And one of the ways in which what happens in our lives when we don't have that resiliency, or when we don't have that sense of purpose, that sense of identity, when we lack an understanding of what we value most, our resiliency wanes in those difficult times, right? So without clarity of our values, without a real sense of purpose, resiliency suffers. And the research tells us that when we identify our values, when we understand our values before, during, and after negative events in our lives, and remember, we can expect to experience 4 to 6 negative events every 5 years. How many overachievers do we have in the house? And you're like, I'll do 4 to 6 this year. I'm going to knock those off the list, right? But we can expect that. Every person can expect 4 to 6. And when we come up with those, the research says if we can identify our values before, during, and after those negative events, that is key to building resiliency in the storms of life. And values are the things that we most value, right? They're the things that we find most important in life. So in your own mind, in your own heart right now, tuning in online, listening on demand, here in the room, out in the atrium, everywhere you might be in this moment, what are the most important things to you, right? Values are things like justice, humor, right? We might think of those things, perseverance, creativity, love. These might be values that we hold. Values aren't goals. They're not something you accomplish, right? We don't accomplish perseverance, right? We live into that, right? We enact these things in our lives. And they reflect, core values, they reflect those most deeply held beliefs. And they then become this fundamental driving force in our lives. So, simply put, having something to live for and knowing what that is makes it easier to move forward and endure the challenges that we face in life. Can I get an amen, brother? Nice. I like that. Good job. Now think about Paul. We've been looking at Paul over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Interesting fella in our tradition. And we've been looking at this one little letter that he wrote, and it's become known as a letter to the Philippians. You can find it in the second part of the Christian Bible, the New Testament. And we've been looking for some wisdom from Paul. Now Paul writes this little letter to a group of people that he gathered and organized as a kind of resistance. They became known as a church, but really what Paul was doing was traveling all throughout the Mediterranean in the first century, and he was preparing people to resist kind of the way of being in the world, and he believed something really powerful had started with this man Jesus and was going to come to completion in his lifetime. Paul believed this. So he gathered these groups together and he formed them, and they became known as ecclesias is the Greek word, and they were churches, but you shouldn't think of like this because it looked very different than this. And Paul would write a letter to them, and he wrote this letter while he was in prison. Letter to the Philippians. So you got to remember, when we read these texts, Paul's not like sitting on a yacht, right, drinking a Mai Tai, right? He's in prison, and he's in a Roman prison in the first century. There's no like yard time. There's no 3 square meals a day, okay? Philippians chapter 1, we read a few of these verses last week, but Philippians chapter 1, verse 15 through 16, as you think about, like, Paul's in prison, see if you can hear Paul's values as I read this, right? As we think about this. So Philippians chapter 1, this is what it says. Some proclaim Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I've been put here in prison for the defense of the gospel. That is the good news that Jesus brings, his understanding of the good news of God's breaking into the world in a new way through Jesus, okay? So he's like, there's all this stuff happening. And he says, the others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering and my imprisonment. Now, we looked at these verses last week, but we kind of ended right there. And we said, listen, one of the beautiful things about Paul in prison was that he saw both the positive and the negative in his circumstances, right? So he saw that good things were happening, but he also saw that people were using it to make life harder for him. And I want to reemphasize that, because sometimes when we talk about resiliency and joyful living, it's really easy to think of like things like toxic positivity. But I don't think we have that here with Paul. We have something quite deeper. So Paul goes on after this. So what has he said? He said, Christ is being proclaimed, some out of good motivation, some out of bad motivation. But here's the thing. He says this, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my salvation. Now, Paul's not talking about going to heaven here. Paul's in prison. He's talking about, I'm going to get out of this place, okay? This is going to save me, rescue me. And then he says this, he says, it is my eager expectation. Do you ever go into like trials and frustrating moments and stuff with the boss you just can't stand with an eager expectation? Usually we don't, right? But Paul had this like knack for it. He says, it's my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. And then he makes this really powerful statement that many of you have heard. He says, for to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. Now I'd like to bring up something here. I believe that Paul is really struggling with suicidal ideation in this moment. And I think if we gloss over that, we're missing kind of what's right in front of us because we super spiritualize Paul too often. But Paul is in prison and he doesn't know whether he wants to live or whether he wants to die. And I think we should hold space for that because suicide and suicide ideation hits a lot of our hearts and a lot of our lives. And sometimes the church hasn't done a good job of recognizing that. And I think we see in one of kind of the heroes of faith for so many people that life got so bad for him, even when he could see good things coming out of it, he said to himself, do I want to live or do I want to die? And so I just want to hold space for that in the room, in our hearts and in our lives. Because oftentimes we want to say, oh, this is a person who doesn't have faith, or this is a person who gave up. And those are, I think, unhealthy and dangerous ways of viewing the reality of life. But in the same moment where Paul is struggling, we get a hint at what he valued in his life. And he articulated it so clear. And I think what Paul valued more than anything else, what one of his core values was resurrection hope. Was resurrection hope. When he says Christ is being proclaimed, what Paul is saying is the resurrection is happening. Now, can we talk about that from a historical perspective just for a moment? Because you might hear the word resurrection. It has all these kind of meanings to you. But I want to talk about what it meant to Paul. So Paul was a Pharisee. And you have to remember that the Pharisees were like a political party. So think Republicans and Democrats and all the other different ones that are out there, right? So Paul was a Pharisee, which was a political party in a culture that didn't separate church and state, okay? So there were ways in which the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, all these different groups believed and thought that the nation should be run, and that also meant the way you thought about God. Now, Pharisees, what made them unique was they believed deeply in what was called the resurrection. It was a fairly new thought in the history of Israel, maybe around for 150 years. But they believed that there was going to be a resurrection. And he had come to believe that this event, and make no mistake, it was an event in his mind. It was a collective thing. It wasn't individual. For Paul, there's no such thing as individual resurrection. It's a communal reality. It's the resurrection at the end of all things, right? And he believed that it had begun with Jesus. He uses this language in other places where he calls Jesus the first fruit of the resurrection. And he believed deeply that this event that his tradition had handed to him had started with Jesus and it would be finished in his lifetime. He really did believe this. And so we have to hold that. So for him, he's in this space, he's in prison, but he has this value that the resurrection has begun and God is restoring all things. Now, here's the thing. He got it wrong a little bit. Right? We're still here. Okay? That's the beauty of the Christian scripture is we get the right and the wrong, which is why it's dangerous to follow it, okay? Wonderful to learn from, great book of wisdom, a lot of pain, a lot of death, a lot of bloodshed when we go to follow it, okay? But that's what's beautiful. Paul's like driven and he has this value. And he goes on to say this, he says, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. In other words, he's saying, if I continue to live in this body, right? If the resurrection doesn't happen or if I die, I can continue and I have all this great work. But I can't say which one I want. I can't say which one I will choose. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ. What does he say? His desire is to die. Ryan, I thought this was about resiliency. You are a terrible speaker. Like, get on topic, right? There's weight in it, right? Like he says, I don't know which I want to do. And he's kind of working this out as he writes this letter. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that's far better. I get out of this prison. I'm out of all the stresses and the frustrations, and I don't have to deal with you all anymore. But he says, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. And we're starting to see a second core value of Paul's. He says, if I stay in this flesh and I have fruitful work, it's really necessary. And he goes on, he says, since I'm convinced of this, I know that I will remain. Since I'm convinced that if I'm here, it's good for you, I know I'm going to make it. I know that I will last you. And I know that I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in faith, so that by my presence again with you, your boast might be about Christ Jesus because of me. So this is the second core value. So Paul values in his own life resurrection hope. But what else drove him? What was his core value in the midst of a very, very difficult moment in life? A very negative experience was that he valued sharing resurrection hope with others. And that drove Paul. Look what he said. What did he say? He said, to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. He says, I can suffer because I know that it's important for you and I'm convinced of it. And so I'll remain and I'll continue on for your progress and your joy and faith. Now, what I want you to get is this, and this might sound really strange to you, but first of all, let me say this. I don't think that everybody's highest and greatest value is proclaiming Christ crucified, like Paul. And that might sound strange to you, because maybe you were in a tradition like I grew up in, that your only reason for existence was to go out and tell people how to say a prayer, how to get them to follow Jesus so they wouldn't go to hell. A lot of pressure on you as a 12-year-old. A lot of pressure there. So I don't want you to hear me today tell you that your number one value should be resurrection hope and your number two value should be go out there and tell everybody. That's not what I'm saying to you today. What I'm saying to you today is look at the power in Paul's life, because he knew what his highest values were. In a very difficult moment in life, he drew on those values and they carried him through. Now, do I think having in your life resurrection hope as a high value is of incredible strength? Absolutely. I would be in a different profession if I didn't believe that. But I don't believe that you're supposed to carry some weight around for the eternal well-being of souls around you. And certainly not the point of the message. The point of the message is this. Paul continued in the middle of the storm, right? He continued in the middle of the storm because he internalized his values and purpose. They weren't just something out there that had been handed him, but he actually made them his own. And that's what I want to challenge us all with is this big question, like, what are my values? Have I internalized them? Am I living into them? Because that's where resiliency will grow in our lives. It's the big why. Anybody ever heard the name Simon Sinek? Ever heard the name Simon Sinek? He wrote a book called Start With Why, I think was the title of the book, right? Did a big TED talk on it. But you always start with why. If you don't have a good why, all the what and how and who and where is going to get all messed up, right? Start with why. So in your everyday normal lives, because that's what we're about around here, when you leave this place, how do you kind of walk into and live into values? Well, first of all, you discern what they are. You just got to think, and they're unique for all of us. But then we have to commit to what we'll call moment-by-moment behaviors that move you in the direction indicated by your values. So moment-by-moment decisions. These aren't big ones. These are little ones, little decisions. Once you identify your values, you start to live into them in the moments in life. And we can call this valued living. We're living by our values. So think of it like this. If you discern that justice is a core value of yours, you might stand up for a colleague at work who's being bullied, right? That will, in a tough season of life, like that could propel you forward. You might participate in nonviolent resistance and protests as a peacemaker. You might drive into that. Maybe if you're ever leading a group at work, or you decide to participate in a fresh perspective group here, or you lead something, you make sure that everybody's voice is heard. Right? Those are little moment-by-moment things. If humor is a core value of yours, right? You're going to tell jokes to cheer people up, probably at the worst awkward times. I know this from experience. Like, not the moment, Ryan, not the moment, right? Or you'll tell jokes, tell your kids, you'll spend time you'll go to like comedy shows because that'll fill you with life. You know, that's just a moment-to-moment decision. What am I going to do? I'm going to do something that's going to make me laugh because it's a core value of yours during a difficult season. You might even find a reason to laugh at yourself during a very difficult season of life because that's a value of yours and you can live into it. Or maybe creativity is a high value of yours. Maybe you just know you have this sense of creativity and you want to challenge the world and you want to create beauty. So you might play in a band, or you might make music, or you might express your feelings through writing or through painting, or maybe if you're working on a team, you'll suggest all these out-of-the-box ideas because that's how you live into those values. And as we start to do this, here's the danger that happens. There are times where we violate our values, or there are times when we can't live into our values. And so I want to say this to you. Your value, is not related to your value, right? Your values don't relate or give you value. Your value is intrinsic. Your value is your presence, So there will be circumstances that come into your life and my life where we can't live into our values for whatever reasons. But that doesn't say anything about your value. Imagine yourself a marathon runner. Anybody ever run a marathon in here? Raise your hand nice. I'd be proud of that nonsense. Be proud of it, right? I've done it twice. I have no idea why I did it twice. No clue. I should have ended after one because it was a way better experience the first time. Right? But if you're driven by, let's just say marathon running and you face an injury, and you can't, right? You have perseverance is your value, and that's why you do endurance sports. And all of a sudden you can't train. That doesn't mean you don't have any value, but that does happen to us. We sometimes start to feel like that. So it's important to recognize that just because you have a season of life where you can't live into your value, where maybe humor is your value and you can't smile and you can't laugh, that doesn't mean you're worthless. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. So as we develop our values, as we identify them, we can learn from Paul, who in a very difficult circumstance drew on them, identified them, processed through it. How am I going to get through this? I don't know if I want to live, if I want to die. I have resurrection hope, which actually says to me, death is actually a wonderful, welcome thing. I don't know what I want to do. But then he lived into a second core value was, I've got to make Christ known. I've got to make Christ known. And so that value drove him in a very difficult season, in a very difficult time. And if we'll identify our values, if we'll think about them, if we'll start to live into them in very simple ways, understanding our core values fast tracks a sense of purpose and direction in our lives. I mean, you can bypass decades of pain and heartache by having a few minutes of intentional thought around, what are my values? Such a great way, instead of thinking about purpose, say, well, what are the values that just I'm naturally attracted to? And so you might come to that space, well, humor. And then you go, well, if my value is humor, then you know what? My purpose is to bring joy into this world. I'm going to bring joy into this. Well, creativity is my value. Well, you know what? One of my purposes is to bring vision and inspiration into this world. You might say, well, my value is justice. Well, then my purpose is to bring hope and equity into the world. One of my values is wisdom, so my purpose is to bring engagement with knowledge and insight into people's hearts and lives. And that's the power of starting with values and identifying them. And there's something really cool about values too. How many of y'all have infinite amount of time? Nobody has a TARDIS? Nobody has those Doctor Who fans in the house, right? We all have limited time, and we all have limited energy. And we have to balance our yes and our no, right? Like, where am I going to say yes? Where am I going to say no? But here's the thing. When we understand our core values, we're empowered to prioritize our yeses and our nos. That's a fill-in right there. How many times do you get to write the plural of yes and the plural of no? Thank you very much. But you get to prioritize them. When someone asks you to do something and you go, I'm not driven by this. This is not core value. This doesn't, and I'm so stressed out. I get to say, no, that's not my best yes. Because it's not going to give me energy. But man, when you and I are asked and we're brought into spaces that our values can be deployed, those things actually give us energy. It's quite amazing. I think that's why Dennis is like this 69-year-old Energizer bunny. Right? Like, I think to myself, when I'm 69 years old, if I have half of that energy, that guy can still bend over and shovel things, He came over to my house, helped me the other day with a sprinkler, and I'm like not quite half his age, but I'm just like, yeah, you're going to have to shovel that, Dennis. I can't do that. My back is already telling me, don't even think about it, Ryan. But I just think Dennis is so driven by his values, to love people, to love God. He gets energy from doing crazy stuff like helping people with their sprinkler that's like leaking everywhere. I'm like, what in the world is wrong with this? Right? But when you're driven by your values, you find energy. And like, that's the best yes that you can bring to your relationships, to yourself, to your church. So people all the time come and say, well, Ryan, I want to get involved. Where can I volunteer? I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. I've been in this game long enough to know this is a bad question. What do you love? What are your values? What are your dreams? Let's find those. And then maybe we need to add or subtract something about our church because God's just brought a beautiful gift here and we need to give you some resources to flourish in what you're called to do. Most churches do it the exact opposite. Get all these big ideas and then try to grab people and force them into, like pigeonhole them into stuff that they think are important, and it wears you out and it burns you out. But when you know your values, you can say, oh, this is a value to me, and I can get energized by giving of myself, by giving myself away. And I can endure and suffer and walk through it. All right. Jimmy had the over of, I was supposed to go 20 minutes. I lost the bet. Sorry. We're going to have communion together. If you'll stand. If you're a guest today, we do this every week. This is a part of a Christian tradition that goes back to a beautiful story of Jesus who gathered with his disciples on the night that he was betrayed. And he broke bread and took a cup and blessed it. And here's the thing, if I can just fast track this, because it can be very confusing and it can be lots of different things. For us here at Crossroads, for me, this is simply a beautiful metaphor of the very nature of the universe, and that is love and sacrificial love. And so we take this bread and this juice that represents the brokenness of the historical Jesus at the hands of the oppressor, and he returned that pain and that suffering with forgiveness and love, and that is what heals the world, and it heals us. So we receive this every week as an opportunity to be strengthened by that beautiful truth. That love and forgiveness and grace and inclusion is what will heal our own wounds and will heal the wounds that are in the world. And so as we sing this one song, so you gotta, don't be waiting around for the second song today to come get your communion, all right? As we sing this one song, you're invited, no matter where you are in your journey of faith, to have a moment with the divine, with one another, and to just explore this idea that love really does heal wounds, that love changes and transforms our world, that inclusion really does break the barriers and the boundaries of life, and that's what this moment is about. So for every person in here, if you're at home and you've grabbed a piece of toast and some grape soda and you're with us, if you're in your car and you're eating a McDonald's fry and a cheeseburger, the body of Christ broken for you and the blood of Christ shed for all 8 billion people on this planet, as a reminder that loving our enemies, forgiving those who would persecute us, heals the world. Please come and receive.